Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kaliroi Stavrianou, and on behalf of Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I'm happy to moderate this series of webinars that aim to educate, promote collaboration, and also promote information exchange about healthcare technology, engineering, and patients' outcomes. All our webinars are recorded, archived, and also live streamed on Facebook. Following the completion of the webinar, the recording material will be accessible on our website, www.globalcea.org. Please note that at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button where you can submit questions to the faculty, and those questions will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. In addition, for posting general comments, there is the option of the chat box for audience interaction. Please use only the Q&A for your questions to the faculty and not the chat box. GCEA is really excited to announce once again the addition of a new live translation feature that we believe will bridge the language gap and enhance your video conference experience. All you have to do is simply click on the Captions tab at the bottom of your screen and select the caption language you would like to read from the drop-down menu. Today's webinar is entitled Risk Management for Medical Technology in Home Healthcare. Now I'm really pleased to give the floor to our webinar's moderator, Mlanden Poluta, who is a Founders Council member in GCEA. Mlanden, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaliroi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This webinar is part of a series arranged by the Educational Committee of the GCEA under the very capable leadership of Professor Said Khalil, our colleague from Brazil. Today we zoom in, as has been mentioned, on an area of increasing importance globally, namely the growing availability and utilization of medical and other health technologies as part of cost-effective healthcare delivery in a home environment. However, it is equally important that the risks associated with such potential are also identified and where possible, mitigated. Likewise, the patient voice as a key stakeholder must be considered. We have three distinguished speakers that will address this topic today. Please allow me to introduce them before we move over to their presentations. First up is Matthew Baratich. Matt is a founder, past president, and fellow of the American College of Clinical Engineering. He's a certified clinical engineer, a certified professional in patient safety, and a certified professional in healthcare risk management. His consulting practice includes performance improvement for clinical engineering and forensic engineering services for medical device-related incidents. Following Matt, we have Bill Gentles, who many of you know as an icon in the global clinical engineering field. Bill is Vice President of BT Medical Technology Consulting. In that role, he has conducted many incident investigations of home care devices. He is chair of the International Outreach Committee for the Canadian Medical and Biological Engineering Society. He has traveled to many low-resource countries to teach clinical engineering topics on a volunteer basis. For 28 years, he served as Director of Biomedical Engineering at Sunnybrook Health Science Centre in Toronto. He has a PhD in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Toronto, and he's a certified clinical engineer. Then last but certainly not least, Debyani Muller. Yani is a founding member of the South African HTA Society. She's a board member of Health Technology Assessment International and chairs the interest group on health technology assessment in developing countries. She currently holds a faculty position with the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where she teaches health technology assessment. Her interest lies in health policy analysis and the pragmatic application of health technology assessment to assess medical technologies for decision-making purposes. I'm sure that you will all agree that these three individuals are eminently suited to address this topic. Like you, I look forward to their presentations. So if I may I hand over to Matt?
Thank you, Calroy. Thank you, Mladen, for the introduction. I hope you're seeing my title slide for our presentation today. Greetings to people all around the world. It's early morning here on Vancouver Island in Western Canada. And let's get this to slides to advance. Yes. So there are three of us who are going to talk about different aspects of this particular issue in turn. And at the end, we have time for questions and discussion. So my background is that in my consulting practice over the last 25 years, I have done a lot of incident investigation involving medical devices. A lot of those cases were in legal cases in the US where someone had sued somebody else. And so that means that people had some seriously negative outcomes that were potentially related to medical devices. Most of those cases were about hospital equipment, but several of them have been for medical equipment that was used for home health care. So today, my role in the next few minutes is to give you three examples of some areas where medical devices for home use were problematic for the patients who were dependent on them. And so I want to start with the Philips CPAP machines. Those of us in hospitals are probably quite familiar with the issues that Philips has had over the last more than 2 years now, where these devices and some related BiPAP and ventilator equipment were recalled by the FDA and by Health Canada because of problems with the sound deadening foam inside the device that was deteriorating and could present a risk to people using these devices. And what's been frustrating to those of us who work for hospitals, for example, is that Philips really provided no good information about how important the risk was, how to balance the risk versus continuing to use the devices, provided no good alternatives for repairs or alternative equipment. And so we in the hospital struggled to support our patients under these circumstances. But what I want you to imagine is if you are a home use patient that's dependent on one of these pieces of equipment. And so we in the hospitals get this kind of information. It gives us some material and some way to make some judgments about how to proceed. But at some point, more than a year ago, the FDA ordered Philips to communicate this information to directly to patients, people using the devices. And you can imagine that for the average CPAP or BiPAP user trying to interpret the language that comes from the FDA or the other medical device regulatory agencies is not easy. It's challenging for us in the hospital. It is even more so for patients trying to decide how big is this risk? What should I do? We have reports of cases where some patients have disassembled their devices to remove the foam inside, thinking that that would reduce the risk. It might reduce the risk. It does increase the noise, and I think it would not be something we'd want to advise to patients to disassemble their medical devices. And so this is the first point I want to make, is that trying to support patients in the home care environment is a big challenge. and can cause significant problems for those patients. There have been reports of a few hundred deaths associated with problems with these devices, and still there's not a good response, in my opinion, from Philips as to what these patients should do. And it's not clear to make a decision. Do I continue to use it, knowing that there's some risk of hazard to myself, or do I stop using it and then not have the benefit of the ventilatory support that I was expecting for this device that I may have rented, or I may have bought, or I may have borrowed from my neighbor? And so this is the first point that I want to make. I don't mean to pick on Philips. This is just an example of a Respironics from Philips, a home ventilator. But I've had a few cases over the years with two of them with this particular model, but also with some other home care oriented ventilators. And these are even more of concern for patients who may be very dependent on these devices for keeping them alive and healthy. This is I would say, a well-designed and widely used device, but in the particular case that I'm going to describe here, we had this device clearly had some problems. And so the investigation in this legal case was to try to understand what had gone wrong. Normally, you can produce a chip that has the event log information on it. However, it's encoded and not accessible to users or to people like myself who are not part of the manufacturer. But fortunately, there's a back door into it, and you can go page by page through 256 pages of information that show the event log. The large black box on the screen is just, I placed that there to block out some identifying information. And fortunately, the manufacturer does provide details about what exactly those descriptions mean and what the numbers in the last two columns mean. But it fell to me in this case to transcribe all of those 256 screens and produce an event log, a small portion of which is shown here. The point I want to make in this particular case is that there was a young man who was ventilator dependent and was clearly having difficulty over the night, throughout one night, and it was a family member who was providing care and operating the device. But this family member was not very knowledgeable and found themselves unable to access any support either from the rental company or from the manufacturer or from anybody else, even from the hospital. There's a long story behind that. But to try to figure out what was going on. And what you can see over those many hours over the night were just almost continuous alarms and button presses to turn off those alarms, some effort to resolve the problems that were not successful, and the alarms continued continuously. And I would have to describe this only as a night from hell, where a close family member is trying to support the loved one and is unable to do it. And there were clearly some other problems that occurred that I won't go into, and the home user was unable to resolve these, and ultimately the patient died. So the question from the lesson I take from this is there's limited ability to support people who may not be very knowledgeable or very well educated who are trying to use this equipment. And it's an important consideration as more and more of these devices are used at home, particularly with elderly people. And as I find myself entering the elderly people population, I'm hoping that we can resolve this going forward. So one more example that I'll give you. This is regarding small insulin pumps from a Medtronic in this case, but there are others just as well. And there was a recall from the FDA regarding certain models and serial numbers of insulin pumps. And again, we have the question of, you know, if we're working in a hospital and we know how these devices work, we can support them. But if you are, mostly these are used at home by people who are dependent on that insulin to keep their blood sugar levels at an appropriate level. And so in this particular case, there was the problem, this is from an FDA website, that it shows that what was happening was this clear plastic retaining ring developed cracks in some of these. And the retaining ring is what holds the vial of insulin securely within the pump so that it's pumped at the right level. And this crack could interfere with the ability to hold that that vial in place, and the result is that you can have either high or low infusion rates, which can be detrimental, and certainly has been detrimental in a number of cases for patients who are dependent on this insulin for their health. And in practice, this is what it looks like. This was the original photograph that was sent to me by an attorney who was supporting one of these patients who had died. And the question was, to what extent was the failure of the device, the crack, as you can see it noted here, to what extent this might have contributed to the patient's negative outcome. And one thing the one point I guess I want to make on this particular slide is that while it's apparently was clear to the attorney who took this picture, it is not clear to me where exactly the crack is and how extensive it is and how it might have affected the device. So, so as an expert, a biomedical engineering expert trying to be helpful in this case early on, it was a struggle for me. How much more so would it be for a patient to decide, well, did I notice that crack? Do I worry about that crack? But really the underlying issue is that none of the cases, similar cases that I've worked on, did the patient know that there was a recall. That information didn't get to the patient. Notice went out from the manufacturer to at least some of the prescribing medical doctors, for example, but they did not in every case get out to the patients themselves. And so there was no way for them to respond appropriately. And coincidentally with this case earlier this year, the ECRI came out with its top 10 healthcare technology hazards for 2023. And number one on the list was gaps in recalls for at-home health devices. And so gaps meaning patients didn't hear about the problem, gaps in the extent that patients are not clear about what they're supposed to do and how they get support from the manufacturer or others. So I'm going to stop here because I just wanted to set the stage for, you know, I think we have this impression that home healthcare equipment is pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward and it's a great idea to have more patients at home relying on these devices. We are certainly seeing that that's not the case. It can be very problematic. And so I'm going to turn this over to Bill to talk about the support from that perspective.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to try and talk about challenges in health technology management for home health care devices. I don't have solutions so much as questions that we all need to wrestle with to try and move forward in this area. Next slide, please. So just to give some perspective, as clinical engineers, we understand the best practices for health technology management in the hospitals where we work. They would include the following, which is really just a subset of many other activities we get involved in, but incoming safety inspections of all devices, scheduled maintenance programs or PPM, unscheduled maintenance programs or repairs, documentation of all service interventions on all devices in some kind of CMMS, hazard alerts and recall management, incident investigation and reporting. Next slide, please. The first problem with applying any of these practices in the home care situation is the question of who owns the medical device that's being used at home. Again, this is a subset of possible outcomes, and retail stores, I'm referring to a Canadian chain of pharmacies that sells some of the simpler home healthcare equipment like wheelchairs, oxygen concentrators, pulse oximeters. You can buy from Amazon, you can buy a variety of different pulse oximeters of varying quality. Sometimes the hospitals provide the equipment. The gold standard in that area would be home dialysis. I'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of slides. Then there are equipment rental companies that deal directly with the patient or the patient's family. And an example that I'm familiar with, companies that buy and sell used medical devices for use in the home. For a number of years, my aging mother was living in an apartment in my home, and at some point in her declining health, she required the use of a hospital bed. We purchased a used hospital bed from one of these companies, and they brought it in and installed it in her room. And when she no longer needed it, they bought it back from us. It's a fairly profitable enterprise that a number of entrepreneurs are involved in. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk a bit more about hospital beds. This issue of entrapment in hospital beds has pretty well been resolved within hospitals with standards and notices, hazard notices, and everyone in the hospital is aware of the hazards of entrapment in bed rails and mattresses. And these are just some of the rather gruesome examples of the way patients can or have been known to die because of improper installation of basic hospital bed equipment. I'll talk now about some examples investigations I was involved with the coroner's office in the province of Ontario. These were in long-term care facilities, but the beds in these examples were in fact identical to beds that you can rent for use at home. So next slide, please. One of the accessories that is available to attach to a hospital bed, and it's a rather nice invention, it's called a halo ring. It is meant to bolt onto the frame of the hospital bed to facilitate a patient who doesn't have side rails, but needs some help getting out of the bed and getting to a standing position. You can just grab on any part of this halo ring and pull yourself up to a standing position. In this case, the halo ring was installed not according to manufacturer's recommendations. You can see there's a large gap between the mattress and the supporting arm of the halo ring, and that cylindrical object that's located between those two is a test device used to measure the gaps around a hospital bed mattress that could be large enough for entrapment. In this case, this is quite a large gap. Patients slid off their mattress, their neck got caught in this gap, and they died. The the problem here was not the device itself, but the fact that it was installed by someone who didn't understand the hazards of creating these large gaps. If they'd installed it properly, this incident would not have happened. Next slide, please. Another type of mattress that's used at home, this is called an alternating pressure air mattress, and it consists of a series of crossways cylinders that are alternately inflated and deflated. Unfortunately, when one of the cylinders next to a side rail deflates, it creates a gap that allows a patient to slide between it and their neck can get caught in the side rail. And this test device, again, illustrates the size of the gap that can be created when that particular component of the mattress is in a deflation mode. Again, the patient was caught between the mattress and the side rail, and they suffocated and died. This, again, was in, although it was in the long-term care facilities, and the nursing staff and the manager of the facility were totally unaware of the widespread hazard notices and recalls about the hazards of hospital side rails. So the information about these hazards is not well communicated, as Matt has pointed out, to any persons involved in the home care situation. Next slide, please. Just to move on from beds to give you a sense of the wide variety of technologies that are moving, and this list is constantly growing. I'll just talk a bit more about a couple of these, but patient lifts, wheelchairs, blood pressure monitors, blood glucose monitors, oxygen concentrators, home ventilators, CPAP, BiPAP machines, pulse oximeters, insulin pumps, chemotherapy infusion pumps, hemodialysis machines, and peritoneal dialysis machines. At least in Canada, the only home care technologies that are well managed at this point in time are dialysis machines, because they are provided out of a dialysis center, and the technologies, the support staff, the supplies are all supplied by the dialysis center. And so there's a team of professional staff managing this technology that is totally absent from all of these other technologies. But we do have a model that could be used as a gold standard. I'll talk a bit about just about wheelchairs, because it sounds like a pretty simple device, and how could you harm anyone with a wheelchair? So again, a coroner's investigation. The patient had a power wheelchair. They also had a work table because they were involved in some creative arts. Unfortunately, the work table that was installed at just the right level so that the joystick on their power wheelchair could become jammed under the bottom surface of this work table. They approached the work table. The joystick became jammed in the forward position, causing the wheelchair to push itself forward against the edge of the work table, causing the patient to suffocate, and they died. Again, a simple device, but with lethal consequences because the installation of the surrounding environment was inappropriate for the device. Next slide, please. So just to give, again, a contrast here, that there are numerous standards that apply to the hospital environment. And again, I'm using the Canadian example, but the Canadian Standards Association, in most cases, is simply adopting international ISO standards. So most of these are copies of ISO standards. And the list goes on. They're talking about health facility design, plumbing installations, HVAC systems, illumination design, healthcare waste materials, cleaning and disinfection of facilities, infection control. Next slide, please. The list goes on. Most people might be familiar with Z32.2, electrical safety and essential electrical systems in healthcare facilities. None of these apply to home care. Next slide, please. There are a few standards that are applicable to home care. Again, I'm giving the Canadian example, but in most countries, there is a building code. Home residences are typically required to, under new construction, required to conform to the current building code. The problem is, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the building code is repeatedly updated as standards change. And so if your house was built in 1941, the only code that it needs to conform to is the 1941 edition of the building code. In the house that I recently moved into, which was built 50 years ago, they had upgraded the electrical outlets from ungrounded two-prong outlets, which was the standard perhaps 50 years ago, to three-prong grounded outlets. However, they neglected to connect a ground wire to several of these outlets. So we had what appeared to be safe grounded outlets, but unless you tested them with some kind of, and as a clinical engineer, I was aware that this could be an issue. And I discovered half a dozen outlets in this house that I'm currently living in that were ungrounded. Home care patients would totally be unaware of that situation. Next slide, please. There are some other standards. 60601-1-1115 does have requirements for medical equipment and electrical systems used in the home healthcare environment. I challenge you to find anyone supplying home healthcare equipment that really knows about this standard. There's also safe installation and operation of hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis machines in a home setting, which is Z364.5. Again, that's a Canadian standard, but it's a copy of an international standard. And then in the US, again, this is limited to the US. There's something called the National Healthy Housing Standard, published by the National Center for Healthy Housing, the American Public Health Association. Again, this is a currently updated standard that applies to homes that require healthcare technologies to be installed, and it gives guidelines about what the home environment should look like if you're bringing healthcare technologies into the home. Again, the knowledge of this standard is not widespread. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about the home care environment for a minute and the hazards that can be encountered in that environment. And again, sorry for the small print here. That's just, I wanted to illustrate the size of the problem more than the details here. But buildings in disrepair. The second one I've already touched on, faulty electrical wiring, circuit breakers or fuses, otherwise unsafe electrical systems, lack of emergency sensors and alerts, lack of adequate heat, air conditioning, humidity, and ventilation, plumbing, running water, safe water supplies, lack of safe sanitation and waste disposal, trip hazards in living, cooking, sleeping entranceways or doorways and common areas, pets that may interfere in the operation of critical devices. Pets may chew on tubings or power cords, causing malfunctions. Exposure to the outside elements from lack of repairs to the roof or exterior of the building. Presence of pests, pollen, mold, chemicals, and other contaminants. All of these exist to varying degrees depending on the financial situation of the patient who is trying to receive healthcare in the home. If they're in rental accommodation, the landlord may prohibit modifications to their living space, even if it's a safety upgrade. If they own their own home, they may be of limited financial means and unable to perform necessary renovations that would be advisable, but nobody else would pay for them. So the series of problems to provide a safe home healthcare environment is quite extensive, and there are no easy solutions to this. Next slide, please. So I'll just wrap up what I'm going to talk about today with a kind of rhetorical quiz. Is there an accepted procedure for reporting hazardous incidents or disseminating incident reports related to home healthcare devices? And next slide, please. The answer is no. Again, this is a huge challenge that urgently requires clinical engineering intervention in the home healthcare landscape. Next slide, please. Just to conclude, clinical engineers are desperately needed to support the growing trend of using healthcare technologies in the home. And again, I'm presenting that as a need, but in every healthcare system in every country, the environment is different, but it requires each of us in our home countries to work with the healthcare system to highlight the challenges of providing healthcare in the home, because it's a growing trend, but it's not currently being managed properly with respect to healthcare technology management. That's where I'll stop. Over to you, Matt.
So I'm the last speaker, and thank you, Kalira and Laden, for inviting me, and thank you, GCEA, for having me here. So you've heard about, the risk, the adverse events, the difficulty in managing these products, and but on the other hand, we are citizens, but also patients sometime or the other, and we have to make our decisions, on what to buy, if we are capable of making those decisions, right? What to buy, what are we looking for? Does this work? And what happens, when we are not able to have a voice or not able to understand these technologies? And who is going to speak for us? Are we able to communicate with our clinicians or, nurses? Are those are adequate nurses or clinicians available where I'm living? And so whom am I going to ask? That's and how do I include, and then not only with that hat, but also as mentioned by Laden, that I am also in health technology assessment assessor, right? So what kind of evidence do I include in my assessment so that, those who are making the decisions, and that can be a patient or a citizen, but as well as the clinicians, then that will help them, enable them to decide not only to buy, but also hopefully, paid by the insurance companies. So with that, I bring you to the subject of advocacy. So next slide, please, Matt. So yeah, I was thinking, can I just be an advocate? Who can be an advocate? Of course, as a carer, I have certain idea about, about the disease or how do I handle a patient, but maybe I don't know enough about the technology, right? So I need to be trained on the technology use, trained about the patient group, and so on. So there are there is lay understanding, but also specialized. And also I'm going out there with my personal experience, or I work as a group, right? So there are different layers of it. And then also, it can be depending upon the society and the culture of that society. Patient advocates, are whichever way we call them, they may be welcome, and others may be, not very, not find it trustworthy. And when you think about elderly patient, if there is not a trust relationship with such an advocate, then there is no, they may not have someone like that. And in other countries, like when I think about the African countries also, there is much more, community workers in work, having that dialogue. So there are different ways of bringing that information or helping out the patient with, application of technology, use of technology, when there is certain maintenance necessary. But I'm not saying that it works everywhere, optimally. We have seen from the stories, from the information provided by Matt and Bill, that it's not working, right? So, and that needs to be also taken into account. So next slide, please. So what, these advocates, what are they voicing, how they are helping patients, and they are able to deal with clinicians, healthcare professionals in diverse settings. It could be also the clinicians, they think, oh, the patients are not, capable of understanding, better I talk to an advocate. So that helps also. And then to provide patients with guidance, and on their condition, what is possible, what kind of technology can be in use, can be procured or not. And also supporting patients with all the administrative work that needs to be done, at least in some settings. And others, you have to pay out of pocket. Next one, please. So the role, of course, there are, other soft roles like psychological, environmental, that I mentioned about the culture, but it's also here we are talking about the technologies that can be used for to treat, for diagnosis or screening. Next one. And purposely, I didn't want to talk about technologies like digital technologies, applications that are, out there. I wanted to talk about, or I wanted to mention or point out those technologies that, for low resource settings, low middle income countries, not so expensive, affordable technologies that can be used at home. And here are some examples that I took from the WHO compendium. Because we have to also think about, what kind of technology are we going to evaluate and with what evidence? Because as you saw, Bill said that there is no evidence, the post-marketing evidence is not available to us or in very limited amount. So which technologies are we as, as engineers or assessors, are we going to assess? Those, most probably those that are expensive. That's what the first criteria that comes. And then those who are of high risk, right? So, and then what about the other technologies? But because they also, there are also risks attached to those. Next one. After finishing. So that brings me to the topic of health technology assessment. And now, as you are going to have the slides, I won't go into depth, but I just wanted to mention that it's a process which takes into account the different dimensions of, using technology, like its effectiveness or safety, what setup or environment is going to be placed these technologies, or what are the different factors, the human factors from the users, when we're talking about home care technologies, there can be many different users, like the patient itself or the carer or such a community health worker. So those different aspects, also the ethical aspects of using these technologies at home, and that should be taken into account. And we are not only looking at at a static point, but during the whole life cycle, which is helpful because before this technology comes into market, we as patients can provide our input into the design of the technology or, the way it's designed so that it's affordable for us. So those kind of information can be provided. Next one, please. So so as I mentioned, the HTA has 10 dimensions now that, we use to assess technologies. And I just wanted to take those dimensions and point out what what kind of evidence we could use for the assessment. So what are the unintended errors, when we think about the home user that should be included? What needs to be changed in this technology so that it is clinically relevant? We need also data that's collected, after it is put into in that home environment. Then, as I mentioned already, we need to take into account all these different costs. And then at the end of the day, is it going to be then affordable for us or not? Or, it's too expensive. And then we're looking at different technologies, different manufacturers, and what is best suited for that environment. And of course, we need to take into account all those other costs that go with not only, the consumables, the maintenance, and so on and so forth. Next one, please. And I think that was my last slide. I talked about the home setting. We have to understand that the patient may not be able to use the technology, properly. They need to be trained. The advocates, the carers, those who are using it. And of course, we're talking about aged population. Is it bringing autonomy to us as a patient? That's why we want to be at home, that enables us to be autonomous and gives us privacy, which is very important also. And then I meant that's covering the last point. So when I go back to, as a recommendation, what I would say is that just not, because it's going to be a bigger issue, and because there are more and more technologies coming into the market, you want to use those technologies at home. So let us, we are a multi-stakeholder group, have that dialogue before, early on during the development of these technologies, so that, those criteria or those issues can be taken into account. And then, yes, and so it's also helpful to not only early on, but while these technologies are being in the market, so that those that are risky, that could be taken out of the market, disinvested, so that it is not hazardous to patients. With that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, Bill, Yanni. We've had 3 insightful presentations that, as Bill said when he began, pose many important questions that need to be addressed. This is our collective challenge, and feasible, accessible, sustainable solutions must be found. The presentations have provided an excellent launching platform for different role players and stakeholders to engage. And as the saying goes, it takes a village. Matt focused on specific devices that are found or increasingly found in a home environment. Bill addressed the issue more from a systems perspective, and I think raised some very important issues, many of them low-hanging fruit, but low-hanging fruit nevertheless that needs to be addressed. And then Yanni opened us up to the important area of governance, if you like, from a health technology perspective that can include many dimensions and criteria, including acceptance, but also safety and cost effectiveness. So I thank the speakers on your behalf. And now to establish one shared take-home from this webinar, we wish to pose 3 questions in a short poll. And now may I hand over to Kaliroy to administer the questions and gather the responses.
I'm sorry, Mladen, the poll is not ready yet. Can you give me a few minutes and do it after the questions to the panelists, please?
Yes, absolutely. So may I first invite the panelists, Matt, Bill, Yanni, if you would care to comment on anything that you found in the other presentations or follow-up thoughts on your own that we should perhaps consider and reflect upon. Over to you.
Need to unmute.
I will just say that it's always enlightening to participate in these. You know, it's the old saying, the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so I try to teach something, but oh my goodness, I am learning more from Bill and Yanni. And my biggest impression is this is a difficult problem. It's a growing problem, and I haven't seen good ideas for solutions. So I'm hoping, as part of the discussion from the many talented people who are participating, that there'll be some comments and ideas, and maybe this can spark some kind of a discussion or working group under GCEA to try to move towards solutions for some of these problems.
Thank you, Matt. I think that's an excellent suggestion, a working group, because I think it is deserving of that focus. And for participants in this webinar, if you have any suggestions, or if you wish to be part of that working group, contribute towards such a working group, if you don't mind just recording that in the chat, and we will follow up after the meeting. But thank you, Matt. Yes, I can only agree. Any others? Bill, Yanni?
Yeah, it's a learning experience. I really thank you very much for inviting me, because thinking about the hospital and not thinking about at home, even though we have patients at home. But as someone also, I just saw a message saying that no recalls, usually do no recalls, in low middle income countries. And if it doesn't work, if the patient is capable of spending that money financing, then they go and buy another product, right? If possible. Or, it just stays there. And if you're lucky, then it's going to be repaired. So and I think we do too very little when it comes to home care technologies. We are talking about digital health, well and good, but we also need devices, right? And that should be managed well. And then, but on the other hand, and I'm sorry, I don't have a solution for it, but how do we, as engineers or as citizens, how do we collect that kind of evidence? Going door to door? Is it going to be done through community workers, and they are the ones? And I'm talking about primary healthcare. Are they going to be the ones then reporting those defects, or how that needs to be done? Because assessments, well and good, but it's what is happening really on the ground, and how do we provide solutions to our patients? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Yanni. Before we go to the poll, Bill, could I put this question to you? So we all aware that many poorly resourced countries rely to a large extent on donated equipment. And I think the assumption would be that that would be the case, that for equipment on devices that could be used in a home environment. So here we have something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it becomes an area of huge potential in poorly resourced settings with weak public health systems, whereby if the healthcare, if you like, component, a significant portion thereof could be moved to a home environment where those technologies and devices might even be more effective. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, there are also major risks associated with that. Do you have a take on, if you like, some specific issues that might be more relevant for low resource settings?
I guess thanks, Mladen. That's a very interesting question. The illustration that comes to mind is during COVID, there was a desperate need for oxygen concentrators. And I recall seeing news stories of patients' families desperately scrounging for sort of, I guess, black market oxygen concentrators so that they could keep their loved one alive. Again, this kind of illustrates the gaps in the current system that are really daunting to try and address. And it all cries out for clinical engineers to start banging on doors and saying to the powers that be, you're not doing this very well. You're doing a very poor job of moving healthcare into the home. And something needs to change, and we can help. I think that's all I can say. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And I think, also to make the point that it's not just clinical engineering practitioners, but clinical engineers in partnership with health technology assessment professionals and other colleagues in the healthcare space, because the HTA toolkit has got some powerful instruments in order to, as I said, apply some governance and also to ask and to be able to answer some tough questions.
Mladen,
thank you for that.
Jump in.
Yes, Adine.
Thank you. Sorry for interruption. Great webinar. I'm following the comments from around the world. It's fantastic, and there obviously a gap has been identified in the presentation. Matt, Bill, and Yanni, my hats off to all of you. That's fantastic. And one point that I'm taking with me is that the cross-discipline of the faculty helped to make the point more clear. It's not just engineering, it's just not assessment, but overall, we are thinking about the patient, we are thinking about the family at home, and that is a change. And as the interim president of Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I want to tell you that I have tremendous growth of interest because of the webinar to facilitate the task force that people are asking for. And already Mibe Smith, one of the listeners on the webinar, already volunteered to participate in this task force. So I want to make the point that in the 5th International Clinical Engineering and Health Technology Management Congress that is taking place this November 10th through the 12th in India, there is a session on home care equipment, and I will be sure to make this point that I'm taking home with me from this webinar. I would like to see a task force being created within the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance. There is a gap, we need to bridge it. And following the Congress in India, there is a World Health Innovation Forum where Ministry of Health faculties will be there on the same venue in the same hall, looking at the same exhibit as we will. And that will be a tremendous opportunity to bring this point up to their attention. So Bill, immediately we can take it to, as you call it, the authorities, and make them aware of what's going on. Where do you report? Why we don't see a report? How do you evaluate? What is the user interface that is in home so much different than that is in a more learned environment of a hospital? How do you get help if you do have a problem with a device? Who do you call? And so forth and so on. And I think the cross-discipline that we see on the faculty today is a key that we need to keep on the task force. So I just want to, Meladen, to let you know that I'm excited about taking this project. Hopefully you, I'm putting you on the hot seat now, can help us bring it to life in the coming Congress in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Yadin, for those comments. And just one thought that came to mind as you were speaking. Perhaps such a task force does need to be multi-organizational, so not just GCEA, but it could be a task force that also has official backing from Health Technology Assessment International, as an example. But yes, I think that's an exciting challenge for us, for all of us. And so we're coming to the end of the webinar, but before we end, we would like to administer the poll that has been alluded to. So if I could now hand over to Kaliroy, you will see the poll in front of you. So please feel free to respond as you see fit.
Mladen, would you be kind to read the questions in order to be recorded for the
Yes, of
webinar
course.
purposes? Thank you.
Yes,
And
yes,
then
of course. So the first question is, are you involved with managing home care medical equipment? Yes, no, or I wish to get involved in the future. The second question, is advocacy needed for use of home use of medical technologies? Options are yes, no, not sure. And the third question is, should we advocate for a risks advisory leaflet for home care devices specific to each device? And the options there, yes, no, not sure. Over to you. Kaliroy, I don't see, oh, there we go, thank you. So for question one, there seems to be a split, and not surprisingly so, because some people will be involved in managing, some in using, some in governing. So I think it's a good thing that there is that split, because it underlines the point that there are multiple roles to be played in managing and mitigating risks associated with home care devices. So I think that's a good confirmation of that. In terms of the next question, is advocacy needed? There's overwhelming support, an indication that yes, it is. I think what remains to be done is for us to unpack what is meant by advocacy, and it will probably happen on a number of layers, and different components and different layers would be addressed by different, if you like, disciplines or sub-disciplines. Again, as I said, inviting and supporting the need for multi-professional and multi-organizational perspective on this. And then last but not least, the concept of a risk advisory leaflet, much the same as one would expect a user or sometimes a service manual, that there should be thought given to a risk advisory leaflet that is very prominently made available for home care devices, whether this be a well-resourced or a poorly resourced environment. So again, these are very useful responses. Thank you to those who have responded, and that'll certainly be taken up by the task force, however it is formed. So all remains for me now is to thank all participants that have joined this webinar, but primarily to thank our three speakers, Matt Baratich, Bill Gentles, and Yanni Muller, for your insights that complemented one another exceedingly well. Thank you to all the participants who posed questions and comments in the chat. We will certainly follow up on those. And then lastly, to thank Kaliroy who's the glue that holds all of us together, as always. Kaliroy, thank you very much for your support. And with that, I wish you well. I wish you a good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. And this webinar is officially over. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.